fans, we are now live with another edition of the Great North Wrestling Podcast. My name is Jack Kilby, and tonight we are very fortunate to have the author and wrestler of this best-selling book, Uncontrolled Chaos, which addresses the storied history of the professional wrestling business in Canada, Mr. Vance Nevada. Vance, I know you've got a busy schedule working shows and promoting the book, so thank you very much for coming on the Great North Wrestling Podcast tonight.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure to be here.
I wanted to start off by asking. I know you've been involved in literature projects in the past, but what was the inspiration to compile what will no doubt be the benchmark seminal historical book, or one of, in terms of the wrestling industry in Canada? What inspired you to begin that process?
Really, the pandemic is to blame for it. Going into the pandemic, I had been a booker for All Star Wrestling, and initially, the word from the government was, "Well, we're going to shut down for 8 weeks and reassess." And being cynics as we are in the wrestling business, we said, "It's not going to be 8 weeks, so let's plan to be out for 6 months." And in the meantime, we thought, from a promotions perspective, let's, take that reset time to, do some merchandising, work on some projects maybe that we haven't had the time to do with the shows. We were sitting the guys down. We had the whole crew come in for a studio day and did a whole bunch of canned interviews, kind of like out of character, like the man behind the wrestler, to give us the content for that 6 month period. And when the 6 months was up and there was no light at the end of the tunnel at all, that we were going to get the green light to reopen wrestling, I went to the promoter, Michelle Starr, and I said, "I'm just going to set everything down for a while, because it's just so emotionally exhausting to put so much of yourself creatively into a process, and then it's going to go nowhere." And so I set all my duties for All Star Wrestling aside. This is a time when we couldn't even go out to restaurants, and hotels are now, this is not a thing. There's no travel happening. So I was home, and after spending a few weeks with my wife just binge watching various series, I just felt like I feel my brain turning to mush. I need a project to focus on, and this is the result.
What was the talk us through the aspect of research for this book, which no doubt can be an esoteric subject, especially considering the wide swath of time that the book covers. Was that particularly challenging to find the material that you needed to do such an extensive documentation?
It was kind of a unique path, because I got interested in wrestling history very early in my career, and it happened, quite by fluke. So when I was a young guy, I was wrestling one of my first televised matches at 18 years old out of Winnipeg, and it was just aired for Shaw Cable, so it was only hitting about 100,000 households. But when I watched the match, the guys who were doing the commentary made reference to an old time wrestler in Winnipeg named Frenchie Champagne. And I said, "Yeah, Frenchie Champagne, he was a tag team partner of Vance Nevada's trainer, Ernest Rowe, and they were a great tag team." I thought, well, that's interesting, because Ernest Rowe, my trainer, never said anything about Frenchie Champagne. But also, when you're 18 years old, you think you know everything about everything. So I thought, well, Frenchie Champagne must have not have been a very big deal, because I've never heard of him, and I'm 18 years old, and I know everything about wrestling. But it inspired me to get into the library in Winnipeg and the archives. And the municipal archives in Winnipeg actually used to be the municipal auditorium where the wrestling events were held in the 40s and 50s and 60s. So here I am in the microfilm room, going through roll by roll of old newspapers in the same place that Buddy Rogers and Edward Kerponche and Killer Kowalski had all wrestled. So, as it started to snowball, I had a really good run of, 20 or 30 years of, local shows and the big shows that came through Winnipeg. It's like, well, I'm waiting on some information from this guy in a private collection. Maybe I'll start Saskatchewan, because I don't think there's that much in Saskatchewan. And then Next thing you know, this results collection is 6,000 pages and includes the results for more than 60,000 shows from 1867 to 2021.
Now, do you think that when I first heard about your project, I'm like, wow, why hasn't someone really done this before, type of thing? Because with the Calgary promotion and some of the major superstars that have come out of Canada, I was wondering why somebody never took that time. Was it just the sheer complexity of the task that you think deterred people in the past?
I think there's been a lot of really good projects, and this isn't to take away from anything that anyone's published before, that did a really good job of telling the story anecdotally. So they would, they definitely, talk to the wrestlers, and they got stories about, well, one time on a road trip to Red Deer, this is what happened. And that's great. But we've never really had this cross reference of, yeah, here are some of the colorful things that happened anecdotally. Now, factually, here's how that lines up in terms of the exact dates that those stories occur. Um, you know, Comparatively, the Stampede Wrestling territory, and I've tracked down more than 8,000 results for Stampede Wrestling from the 40s into 2008. When sort of the heart bloodline of Stampede ended.
Hmm.
Stampede Wrestling was actually much easier to research than Ontario and Quebec. So when you take a look at Stu Hart's schedule, typically it was Friday night is Calgary, and that's television. Saturday night is Edmonton. Sunday night is off. Monday would be Lethbridge. Tuesday would be Red Deer. Wednesday, Saskatoon. Thursday, Regina. Friday is back in Calgary, and that's the loop. So if you were, and I would typically like marry my wrestling schedule with opportunities to get into those libraries. So if I knew I'm wrestling in Regina and I need to be at the arena for 5 o'clock, I'm arriving at Regina at noon so I can go to the library for a few hours and get into their old newspapers. But once you had the circuit, you could kind of work off that rhythm. I know I need to check for the ad that's in the Wednesday paper for the Thursday night show. I need to check the Friday paper for the results. But in Ontario, I mean, if you've ever looked at Pro Wrestling Illustrated magazine is often sort of the jump off point for us to see those lineups for those old shows at Maple Leaf Gardens, for example, right? And you would see these shows in the 70s where they had like 10 matches at Maple Leaf Gardens, and you're like, wow, like that must have been a huge payroll. But what the Tunney circuit was doing was they would all, excuse me, they would have all of the guys in Toronto for Thursday night at Maple Leaf Gardens. But as soon as they would leave Toronto, now that would break into three crews, and you had three towns a night running through the rest of the week, three match shows, and then they'd meet back up in Toronto. So if you found one loop, you were excited. You're like, yeah, I know the Tunney loop. It's Toronto, and then da 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 da. No, wait a minute, that's just one crew. Now we got to find
Hmm.
those other two loops. And it was the same thing in Quebec, right? Montreal, particularly in the summer months from April to October when those hockey rinks opened up and the ice was out. Now you've got all of those little towns running. And even worse in the 70s when you now had the promotional war of the Rougeaus against the Vachons, where in the province of Quebec you had six towns running a night. It's just
Wow.
unbelievable volume of wrestling that was taking place.
So during the course of all your research, right down to being in libraries, the microfiche, etc., if you could point to either a series of or particular factoids that came out that was the most surprising to you, being a well tenured person in the business, what would that be, or is that possible to point out?
I think for me, what's really fascinating is most of the books that we've read about wrestling or documentaries that we've seen have talked about the big circuits. So we'll talk about Eddie Quinn in Montreal. We'll talk about Sander Kovacs in Vancouver. But there was such a strong, particularly in Quebec, such a strong local scene that was happening in Montreal at points from the 30s into the 50s, you could find live professional wrestling every single night of the week in Montreal somewhere. And a lot of those guys that were on those shows, that wrestled for 30 years, and one guy whose name appears in the book, and it was kind of almost, pardon me, just recovering from bronchitis. Um, it was a little bit cathartic in that, you know, there has been a book about the Quebec wrestling history, Mad Dogs, Midgets, and Screwjobs, published by Pat Laprade and Bertrand Hebert, and it's a fantastic book. But so whenever I was covering Quebec, I want to make sure that I'm not just repeating the same stories that they've already told us. Let's find another way to dig deeper. And so when you had promoters like Silvio Sampson, who was considered kind of a lesser promoter, you know, his big claim to fame was that he was the promoter that gave Pat Patterson his start. But the story for Silvio is much deeper. He promoted for 30 years, and he even had a few 10,000 plus crowds in his summer schedule when he would promote outdoor stadium shows in Montreal. One of the main guys that wrestled for Silvio was a young wrestler, or a junior heavyweight wrestler named Sam Chuck. And Sam Chuck is not a name you've probably ever heard before. He's never had his name published. I've never seen a photo of him. But then through this process, you see, wow, like you look at Montreal from that period, about 1935 to 53, Sam Chuck was like a machine, you know, like year in, year out. You know, he's wrestling 3 or 4 matches a week for 30 years, you know, like he just, and getting a lot of newspaper play as well. But he was never a main event guy. He was 165 pounds, junior heavyweight guy, wrestling the local club shows. So to bring some of those guys into the spotlight, that it wasn't all just Yvonne Robert and Whipper Billy Watson and Gene Kiniski. Behind that, there were the guys like Roy McClarty and Eric Froelich and Moose Morawski, and so many of them contributed to the wrestling business, and it was really important to find a way to acknowledge them all by name in some way.
Awesome. Yeah. Which homegrown promotion do you think, through the course of your historical research, has sort of been, to dilute it down, the most important for the modern era business in Canada, aside from, you know, WWF loops or whatnot? What grassroots promotion do you think has left its mark that will continue?
All time.
I
I think that Stampede Wrestling has to be it. If you're looking at us at a single organization, the guys that came through, you mean people don't even realize that, you know, you even had like second generation wrestlers like Greg Valentine, and you're like, yeah, that's great. Greg Valentine got in the business because of his dad, Johnny Valentine, and that's true. But when he told his dad, I want to be a wrestler, Johnny sent him to Calgary. Greg Valentine broke in the dungeon. Superstar Billy Graham broke in the dungeon, right? You had Brian Pillman, so many guys that came through that they spent time in Stu Hart's basement. So Stampede Wrestling, you know, really was that circuit. And there's a lot of migration that you see in that time period, where when you put the whole national picture together in one results file versus just one city or even one promotion, now you see the migration of guys, you know, from January to December, where, yeah, we did 6 months for Stu. Then we went out to Vancouver and worked with that circuit for 3 months. And then we moved on to Toronto, and they're there for a little while in Montreal, and then summer in the Maritimes, and back and forth. So a lot of guys like Leo Burke, you know, for example, over the course of his career, wrestled more than 3,000 matches in Canada.
Wow.
You know, it just amazing stats that you wonder, like, will anyone ever eclipse those numbers with the schedule that we have in wrestling today? And I don't think it's possible.
Did you happen to see the Tales from the Territories Vice production on Stampede?
I didn't see that episode, but I have seen a few of them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's quite an interesting roundtable discussion. Moving on to the Vancouver territory, I wanted to get your, and I know you have ties there, et cetera, but I'm wondering, it's interesting that you mentioned Stampede. Stampede comes up a lot in the historical context, but the Vancouver territory, I think, is one that in a lot of ways, we're talking the time frame when Al Tomko took over from Kiniski, et cetera, when it was an NWA territory. Do you think that, given the fact that I remember as a 5-year-old child turning on the TV and seeing All Star Wrestling from BCTV because it was nationally syndicated across the board, which was the first promotion to do so. Do you think in a lot of ways that that period of time, that Tomco Promotions doesn't really get the credit that it deserves for contributing to the popularity of the sport via its TV product?
I would agree with that. I think, in a lot of ways, when you look at the coverage in the time period, so during the 1970s, how much media was anyone in Canada getting in the wrestling magazines? When they were the venue, right? And this is a time period where there was maybe 12 or 15 monthly publications available in your local newsstand anywhere in Canada. You'd go down to the drugstore, and now you're trying to figure out, where am I going to spend this $3? So, I want to get them all, and I can only get one.
Mm-hmm.
But during that time period, you know, Stu Hart really didn't get a lot of press for Calgary. In reality, it was always overshadowed by what was happening in Toronto and Montreal, because those were the bigger centers, and particularly when you were dealing with U.S. magazines, right? Toronto and Montreal had the bigger venues and had the bigger crowds. But Vancouver, I've always felt, has been long overlooked. When they say, yeah, Toronto and Montreal, yeah, that's the East, and Stu Hart is the West. Okay, but then you're also excluding Winnipeg, which was a pretty big deal, and you're excluding Vancouver. Vancouver was another territory where a lot of guys got, some of their first matches. Sergeant Slaughter, back when he was beautiful Bobby Remus, he was working out of Vancouver in the 70s. Larry Zbyszko spent 6 months there, like basically right out of training camp, spent a little time at home in Pittsburgh, and then off to Vancouver to get seasoned, and then come back and start his program with Bruno. Uh, Road Warrior Hawk had some of his first matches here. Rick Rude. There's a lot of guys that came through Vancouver. Don Morocco, another guy, had his first match in the Vancouver territory. Under Sander Kovacs, definitely it was a much more respected territory. But I think people often um, overlook what Al Tomko actually did achieve there, because they didn't appreciate the way that he conducted business, and sort of recognized as one of the most frugal men in professional wrestling history. He didn't want to invest in the American talent if he could produce homegrown talent. But there's a lot of guys like Bobby Bass is one who will say, because of his philosophy, it helped make me a big deal in Canadian wrestling for a period of time.
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate that the tape library, aside from a clip here and there, doesn't really exist from that era in any sort of completist fashion. I think that is ultimately what hurts the legacy. But I couldn't agree with you more. As a veteran wrestler yourself, who has on record as the most Canadian heavyweight title reigns, impacting and passing the great Leo Burke. Do you have any in ring goals left that you'd like to achieve? Putting the authorship aside for a moment.
Yeah, I think one of the things that has come up for me always is my memory is poor, actually. That's why I have to write everything down. And as I started to go through my match record, or you'd talk to different guys, or you'd be traveling from town to town, and you're hearing stories, and they'd ask you like, "Well, you've wrestled everywhere in Canada." I said, "Yeah, you know what? I've wrestled in the Northwest Territories and been to the East Coast and the West Coast, but the one place that I have not wrestled is Montreal." And so somehow, some way, I'd like to try to figure out how we're going to get that match done and wrestle in Montreal.
Excellent. I understand you participated in a number of the famous Tony Condello Northern Death tours, which the fans really like to hear about, and some of the notable personalities that have engaged in those in the past. Do you have any stories from the Northern Death tours, or working for Mr. Condello in general, who is, I think, a larger than life figure to this day in the industry?
He really is. There was a period of time in Canadian wrestling where um, kind of similar in the way that, Honky Tonk Man said this to me one time. He said, in the 80s in the WWF, when guys were all getting called up from the regional territories to now being national stars, if you didn't work Calgary on your path up there, we didn't consider you to have paid your dues. You weren't really a wrestler, because so many guys had come through there as a developmental system. And in the 90s, that benchmark was, if you haven't done a Winter Roads Death Tour, you haven't paid dues. And so the first time that I got booked to do one of those, I thought, this is awesome, this is amazing. And that was in 2000. I get to go and have this sort of like rite of passage to, that so many guys before me have done. And I went and did it, and it's a brutal environment. I mean, first of all, you're dealing with Canadian winter in February, with very harsh winter cold conditions, but you're also spending like hours and hours traveling on these muskeg trails through the bush, not paved roads. And then when you get the reprieve from those bumpy muskeg trails, you're driving across the ice, across frozen lakes in northern Manitoba. And it's funny, when you come back on in the first tour, you're like, okay, well, people have done this for 20 years. Obviously, it's safe. But as you're like inching out onto the lake for the first time, you see like 20 feet over to your left, there's a truck that's like half submerged in the ice, and you're wondering why are we doing this? But it's also funny to work with talent that's maybe from the States or from the West Coast that aren't even familiar with winter. That they're on holding onto that door handle the whole drive, thinking that, well, if the van's going under, I'm jumping out. But the reality is, like, if you didn't die by drowning, you're going to die from exposure, because there's no way you're getting to land. So either way, you're dead. But I think there's a couple other challenges with that tour in particular. I mean, the cold and the travel is one thing, but you're going into communities, and typically when you're on a wrestling tour, you even if you're working multiple days, you go and you do your thing at the arena. Yeah, you're traveling together in close quarters, but at the end of the day, you go back to your hotel room with whoever your roommate is, and you've got a bit of a reprieve, from the insanity. And maybe you can vent, particularly, if you don't get along with someone else on the tour, you've got a little bit of like space. On this tour, there is no space, because you're going into communities that don't have hotels. So when the show's done, you usher everybody out of the building, and you're sleeping right there in the gymnasium where you've just wrestled. So if you're lucky, you're able to steal one of the mats off the ring, and you've got a soft place to sleep. But you're cooking your own food in the home ec rooms. You're sleeping. You're living together. You're traveling together with people for 12 to 17 days, at a stretch. And if you're not tight with all those guys that are on that crew, it can be incredibly isolating. And I've seen guys just completely crack and withdraw. And midway through the tour, like, the only time that they even have a remote resemblance of themselves is that 15 minutes that they're in the ring. And then they just go completely back to, they're hiding in a corner, reading a book, and just like, within themselves, that they leave that tour and they realize, I never want to wrestle again.
So not for the weak of heart or the faint of heart, as they say, for sure.
It's brutal. I did the first one, and there was just sort of this feeling that, well, did it beat you? And no, it didn't beat me. I'm still wrestling. So I went back the second year just to show that, that I wasn't scared off. But after the second year, I thought, I need to find somewhere else to be booked, like during February, so I've got a reason to say no. But I ended up ribbing myself, because I took a booking with Calgary-based Can-Am Wrestling. They called me and they said, yeah, we've got a 7-week tour and you're booked. I'm like, great. But they were going to the Northwest Territories in February. So that was even worse.
Definitely.
But the pay was good. So I did that one 2 times as well.
So back to the perspective of your book again for a minute. You document how successful the wrestling business was, and I know a lot of people have hit on this. People like Jim Cornette that talk about how the territory system provided a really decent. I mean, the travel was rough depending on where you were at, Oklahoma or whatnot, but you were making a decent living, if not, good living, and depending on where you were in the card, whatever territory you were at. Do you ever see the independent, and we have several thriving independents in 2022 going into 2023. Do you ever see that territory system again coming into a more prominent factor in the business, especially with the majors talking about cutting down on house shows? I know the WWE were talking about not doing that, but now they're doing it again. AEW runs, but they're largely television products. Do you think a new revitalized territory system, could spring up to provide workers with good places to work and good payouts, that sort of thing?
I would love to say that it could, um, but I think that egos will kill it every time. Um, the closest that I, came to see it personally was in uh, 2012, 2011. I was working with Fred May, and Fred was actually the television producer for Mayford Productions, was his production company, and he was the guy that actually got Stampede Wrestling into syndication in the 80s. And so he held the TV contract in '89, and just part of that whole deal with Stampede Wrestling was, and the death of Stampede Wrestling at the end of '89 was a conflict between Bruce Hart's creative and Fred May, who had the television contract with TSN. And when he broke off his deal with the Hearts, he started promoting on his own, and he actually had CNWA Wrestling on TSN for 1990 and 91, something like that. So I had crossed paths with Fred in 2011, and he said, "Well, what would you think about trying to get wrestling on TV nationally again?" I thought, this is great. Like, if you've got the connections with television to make that thing go, let's be really honest. There isn't one promotion particularly in Western Canada at that time, that has the roster depth to have national television. So we need to strike some partnerships. So with the hook of national TV, we were able to get 9 promoters to agree to a single direction. Uh, in their own markets, they were still promoting under their own brand, but every couple of months we would bring sort of the best of the best to the central location. We would tape a bunch of television. The idea was then for Fred to produce it and then pitch it to a national network. And when we started, there was a lot of other promoters that weren't involved that sort of guffawed at it and said, well, that's going to fall apart because nobody's going to be able to keep all those egos in check. And when you realize that, we're not trying to take over. Like, I have no interest, if I'm in Alberta, to go and try to promote Winnipeg, because I know the legwork involved with promoting. I don't want to go to Winnipeg. You do Winnipeg. I'm doing Red Deer. This guy's doing Edmonton. This guy's doing Lethbridge. This guy's got Vancouver. When you really look at it, that was the model of the territory system. Stu Hart is credited as being the patriarch of Stampede Wrestling. Stu Hart promoted Calgary. Mike Bulat promoted Edmonton. Darby Melnick promoted Lethbridge. Ned Powers promoted Saskatoon. Bob Leonard had Regina. It was this network of promoters working together under the shared umbrella of television to make it work. Now, when you look at Ontario, for example, could it work in Ontario? It definitely could, because when you look at the 20, 25 promotions that are running in Ontario right now, and then break it down, and I really saw this as I was starting to really dig in to analyze the results and stats. You really only have 3 crews in Ontario, but it just depends on where your political affiliation is, how it lines up, right? You've got I won't break it down. I don't want to have heat coming into Ontario in a few weeks, but you've got sort of like these 3 different groups of guys, and they're all aligned with their various groups of promoters. So maybe you've got the heavyweight champion in this promotion is also the heavyweight champion here, here, and here simultaneously. That tells me that creatively, from a booking perspective, you already have the mechanics there to say, we agree with whoever that guy is as the heavyweight champion. Okay, now let's get together and do some branding. And so when we did that CNWA, I really call it like a CNWA experiment. in 2011 and 12, we got the promoters to agree, yeah, let's get together and do things that are bigger than what we could do on our own. So we were publishing our own magazine every other month. We had some shared website material. We had CNWA sort of co-branding on everything, not much different than NWA affiliates back in the day. But when the national television didn't materialize, the whole thing crumbled quickly. So the key is, first of all, TV. And maybe through new platforms, maybe that is streaming, maybe that is YouTube, maybe that can still be the thing that's happening. And there's a lot of promotions that are having great success with that. But without TV, in some manner, you've got nothing. And then behind that, you need to have a significant enough investment from the people involved. It can't be promoters that are just running basically on the budget to run that night's show and then hoping that they sell enough tickets that's going to help fund the seed capital that they need for the next event. So unless people are going to get really serious about it, you'll never television, money. And once you've got those two things together and you've got a commitment from television, that's when you'll have the opportunity to have name guys get interested and want to be involved. And like a Bret Hart or somebody that will now add to the mainstream credibility of it to say, yeah, I endorse this and I can get behind it. And then it could go. But I really think that we're going to run into that problem where the egos at the local promoter level will kill any potential to even get that discussion off the ground.
Which it's interesting that you have that assessment. Those of us who are aware of that dungeon show in Calgary a couple of weeks ago, that was a loaded show, and apparently didn't draw very well. And I don't know if they had television support or not, but marketing seems to be the key, along with cohesiveness for a territory system.
Marketing is probably one of the biggest challenges, and is actually something that I found really apparent, when I was doing the research for the book, that it was easier for me to find the newspaper ads and the results for shows in the 1930s than it was in the 2000s. Just because there was, like anything in the last 5 years, now people are so savvy to some of these wrestling websites like cagematch.net that somebody in the organization is posting those results or sharing them with those websites. So some of that stuff is easy to find, but we definitely have a void from about 1990 to 2005 where people weren't advertising in the newspaper. They didn't have the relationship with the local media to get television, radio, or editorial coverage. And now there's so much reliance on, well, we'll just put it on social media and that's our avenue. But social media is only good for the audience that you already have, right?
Not the casuals, right?
Yeah, you still got to go out there and hit the streets. Like maybe postering isn't the way anymore because people aren't out walking the streets. They leave their house with intent. But there has to be another way to reach the casual fans and sort of the people that are on the periphery.
I also wanted to ask you about your association with the Cauliflower Alley and the fact that you're the editor of the international newsletter. Devin and myself have been to several reunions and clearly believe it's a very valuable organization, and the mandate is bang on. What do you think needs to happen to raise the profile of CAC and ensure a growing support for the ex workers that it services, along with preserving the history of the pro wrestling business? What do you think needs to happen there moving forward?
The most important thing right now is, I think, a generational shift. So when I came into the organization, originally, my first introduction was 1999, but I didn't really become a lifetime member until 2010. For me, being a historian and a student of the game, I love reading the newsletter and reading the stories of, what happened in the 1960s, and some of those things and the stories of the individuals that built the business. I like that. One of the things that I think is is something that I'm repeating often, not just at the CAC, but in other environments, to say the kids that we're introducing to the wrestling business right now, even if they're really diehard and they're really keen, 25 years ago for them was the Monday Night Wars. For them, that was classic wrestling. So anything that happened before 1990, this is like not even on their radar. So if you have an organization that is focusing on the lifetime and legacy of people whose careers were done by 1990, there's a whole new generation of wrestlers that can't relate to that. This is now grandpa's age, and maybe they're not even tight with their own grandpa, right? It's too much of a leap. We need to bring that forward. Yeah, definitely. Let's celebrate the legacies of those legends, and even better if they're still alive and we have a chance to celebrate with them, not over them. But at the same time, we can't discount the way that the wrestling business is now. You know, there are young wrestlers who are wrestling every weekend. It's not the territory system where they can wrestle 5 or 6 nights a week, but that's all that they have, right? It's a circumstance of the time that they got into the wrestling industry. It's not lesser, it's not more, it's different. And in order for us to make sure that we have succession within the Cauliflower Alley Club, we need to find a way to be embracing those 5 and 6 and 7 year guys and girls that are in the wrestling business now, making their contributions to the industry feel valued and equal to what has happened before. And so that is a critical thing. Um, you know, if we look at the membership and the people that have been life members, the number of life members we lose annually versus the people that are signing up as life members is an uneven scale. And we'll continue to see that as we continue to lose the boomers over the next decade. So unless we've got those guys in their 30s and 40s now sort of stepping up to take the lead for the next generation of the club, then we could be in real trouble.
And that kind of speaks to the demographic of the industry. You hear that, you know, who are going to be the legends in say 20 years from now, when as a whole, with a few exceptions, the focus for the national company seems to be on the company itself as opposed to creating stars. So
Yes.
I'm not sure how that's going to be bridged, but I think you're right. There has to be a large investiture from the younger generations at this point in time.
Yeah, we need to find ways for that to have value for them. Um, Especially, for Canadians that are going to Las Vegas, and we've pointed this out to the CAC, right? Our membership is the same price as the Americans, but it's going to cost us 35% more, right? Our travel to get to that reunion in Las Vegas is more. Our costs for the week are more. So if you've got this Canadian indie wrestler that's just barely hanging on, they're juggling their daytime job and doing their wrestling gigs on the weekend. Anytime they're taking a day off, it is to go make money somewhere, right? And if we need them to now take a week off and go to Las Vegas, what is the value that we can return? What's their ROI on that? So, we do have the seminar series that takes place during that weekend, but I think that there are avenues definitely with the people that we've got in the room where we can more actively make that a professional development week for Canadian wrestlers. Like if you've got Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler and guys like that in the room, why aren't we running like a little bit of a talent mini camp tryout where you can get assessment from people who have booked, have promoted, have hired and fired talent for television, where they can just give you that feedback, right? It's so difficult for guys to get into the system now, right? If you were able to just show somebody a spark of something one time, right? So there's a lot of different ideas. A few years ago, when they had the Rising Star Award, one of the pieces that they added to that as a value add, if you were the recipient, is You got a gift certificate from High Spots for a pair of boots and some gear, but then you also had a week's paid tuition at Harley Race's camp in Missouri. Well, now you've got something. Now you've got, okay, some gear and a chance to train with the wrestling legend. We're onto something here. And that year that was introduced, I think we had something like 25 applications for that award. And usually it's, we might get two or three nominations, but then it really comes down to club members saying, well, I think this guy should be considered for, honors this year. And I'll reach out to them and see if they're planning to attend. So there is potential for it, but we need to get the right people, driving the bus on those particular initiatives.
As you look back on your career before we wrap up tonight, what in a nutshell would be your, I don't want to say favorite opponent, favorite match, but what was the absolute highlight of your career from a professional standpoint that provides you with the most pride?
I think overall, probably my longevity, in the industry. When I started, I was 160 pounds at a time when 160-pound guys weren't encouraged to be involved, right? The sort of like the floor was 200 pounds. Um, so that first year that I was in the business, the veterans did everything they could, physically while training, physically in the matches and behind the scenes with the ribs to really make me consider doing something else. And then, to have stayed in as long and then, to have the opportunity to work with so many people at the top of the industry. Um, Probably the series of matches that I had with NWA world champion Adam Pearce really stands out. Um, and not for the reasons that you might think. You think, oh, yeah, you got to challenge for the NWA world title, which was huge. But it was also one of the moments in my career where it was a real wake up call for me personally to realize, like you're good enough that you're getting booked everywhere, but wait a minute, there is a tier level here that is happening. And I realize in this match, I'm working with one of the actual masters. Like I can feel that as good as I ever thought that I was, this is why this guy is the world champion. And it was a wake up call. In the first, and not in a bad way, but in the first 5 minutes of locking up with him in the first match that we had together, you realize, wow, okay, this is what we're talking about. And it's not that that couldn't be appreciated from watching tape, but a whole different thing entirely when you're in the ropes, one on one with the individual.
Have you ever given any thought to an agent's role or some form of creative role with one of the major organizations, or is that something that's not a priority for you while you're still active in ring?
I think, at one time I was really, really interested in it. At the point when Adam Pearce had been called up and he was a coach in the performance center. And then a good friend of mine, Sarah Stock, who I had actually helped get into the wrestling business, and she had gone through TNA, and then she was a coach at the performance center. At the point when they both got called up for producers, and I saw, okay, well, maybe there's an opportunity for me to get in there as a coach. And I spoke with Sarah, and she said, actually, your name was discussed. And I was like, wow, that would be great. But I think, the older I get, uh, and the more the business changes, I don't know if I would enjoy that role as much as I maybe would have 10 years ago. Plus, just the volatility of wrestling and being a guy with a young family. I think I want to find that job with pensionable earnings and a guaranteed paycheck, and be able to just indulge my wrestling addiction on the side, as it were.
That's awesome. So what's next for you, be it as an in-ring worker or author? Do you have any more projects that you're sort of kicking around upstairs, or can we look forward to more works from yourself?
You know what? The interesting thing with the book is, as soon as it came out, I was hearing from friends and people in the business who were saying, "Hey, here's the next follow up for you based on this. Here's what you do next, right? Like do Uncontrolled Chaos USA and approach American wrestling the same way that you have Canada, and become your brand. And then you go, okay, yeah, Uncontrolled Chaos Japan. Um, those are big projects. I don't know if I have that in me, but there definitely is a follow up project that I have in mind for this one. I mean, Uncontrolled Chaos tells the story of Canadian wrestling from 1930 to the present. What I would like to do next is an illustrated directory of Canadian professional wrestlers, very similar to the WWE Encyclopedia, but now really dig in. So we've tried to acknowledge as many guys by name in this book, but now to actually say, we've talked about Brad Alexis or Carl Jepson or Hannibal or whoever, all of these guys that have contributed to the fabric of Canadian wrestling. Here they are, and here's a little bit more on their backstory. Or maybe you saw this guy who became a big star with the WWE. Well, let's talk about their Canadian roots. So that's a project that I've already started compiling a list of who would be included, um, and it's trying now to figure out, okay, well, where do we start to draw the line, because we can't include everybody, of course, but trying to get as many men and women in there as possible, and keep it at a point where we're probably in about the same page range, that 462 pages. So that's down the road.
That's excellent. It's certainly filling a void, as you said, to be in one spot, and all the attention that that the business is getting from the Canadian perspective is long overdue. As you said, there have been works hitting this territory, that territory, this personality, but I think the your format and the completist nature of it is quite special. Where can we find you on social media, Vance? What do you have any plugs?
Yeah, absolutely. You can find the Facebook page for the book on Facebook at Uncontrolled Chaos Book. There's also a website directly for the book where you can order directly online from the publisher, uncontrolledchaosbook.com. And the book is also on Amazon. And over the past few weeks in October, at one point, we had reached number 2 for the hard copy book that you've got in your hand right there for wrestling books. We were behind only John Moxley. So that was a really good spike. And I see that even now we're in hardcover and paperback. It's number 1 and 2 for most wished for items in wrestling books for the Christmas season. So if you've got a wrestling fan on your Christmas gift giving list, well, the chances are they want this book already. So help them out.
Excellent. Well, again, Vance, thank you very much for coming on tonight, and to all the Hannibal TV viewers, this is a must-have for the tenured Canadian wrestling fan, and even the current generation that are looking to find out a little more about the history and fall in love with the business as we all did back in the day. So once again, Vance, thank you very much for coming on. It's been an excellent interview and very much appreciated.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Take care.